Welcome to the Think Podcast with Joel Sedekase. I'm Joel Sedekase, and we are continuing a tradition today where Dan Osborne, Reverend Dan Osborne, and I get on and talk about some pressing theological, biblical, religious issue. And this week, we're talking about something that has to do with this week, and that is Holy Week. Now, as you can probably see, Dan is not in the church office right now. I'm not in the Think Institute study right now. I am very much on what appears to be a big old beautiful country porch. That is because my kids and I have been hanging out over at Grandma and Grandpa's out here in the hinterlands of Chicagoland. And Dan, where are you setting up shop today?
Same place I've been the last 2 weeks, in my bedroom, because this is where I can fit a desk, I can close a door, and I can look out a window all at the same time. So that's so
you have a desk. You have a desk in there?
Actually, so the desk I'm using is Courtney's grandfather. He was a pastor for many years. This was his childhood desk. So this is like a super old desk. Sorry, I didn't hear that, Joel. This is Courtney's grandfather's desk. Man, I'm not able. I can't hear you. I can't hear anything.
Okay, Dan, can you hear me now?
I can't. Sorry.
Okay, here's a pro tip for everyone who's trying to do a podcast or a video. There's a little mute button down at the bottom, and if you push it, no one can hear anything that you're saying. It's not so much a technology issue as it is a dumb issue. So, so Dan, let's talk about Holy Week, and this is truly a Holy Week, unlike anyone that I've ever experienced. Everyone's home, everyone's locked down. My question is this: does that matter? Does the fact that this is Holy Week, should we be especially upset that we're on lockdown right now? Should that matter more to us because this is Holy Week? What's so significant about Holy Week? Why do we even call it Holy Week? Give us some of the significance on that.
Yeah, so I think for most Protestant Christians today, Holy Week has meant not a whole lot more than just the week leading up to Easter. And I'm talking about not the mainline Protestant denominations, but non-denominational folks, Baptist folks, tend to view Holy Week as the week between Palm Sunday and Easter Sunday. And there's some big events that happen in the biblical storyline, the gospel narratives, that we may remember. Probably Good Friday is the big one that most people are familiar with. But actually throughout Christian history, believers have
Good Friday,
we've used this week as kind of a way to follow in the footsteps of Jesus' final week in his earthly ministry here.
Now, I did a little research, and what I found is that there were Holy Week celebrations and pilgrimages going on in the very, very early days of the church. I'm talking like 2nd, 3rd century.
Yeah.
And which is very interesting because now we're getting back to the time in history before there was anything like what we might today call the Roman Catholic Church. People consider Holy Week to be sort of like a Catholic form of observance, a Catholic ritual. And for me, I grew up in a Protestant church. It was an evangelical free church.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't, in fact, we really tried to kind of shy away from anything that at all smacked of dead, dry religionism, and unfortunately, some of the church rituals and traditions also got lumped into that. So is Holy Week something that Protestants need to care about? Is it something that we're free to care about, or are we violating the Apostle Paul's admonition not to think of one day as more holy than another, and observe holy feasts and special days and stuff like that?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. I'm very hesitant to say that we ought to celebrate these. I think there's something, kind of the not irony, but the interesting facet of Easter Sunday is this. It tends to be the day that, you're kind of in this awkward place where it's not as if the resurrection matters more on that day, or that you should get especially excited about it, right? That's really what we do on the Lord's Day. That's why believers have set aside a day to
what, Dan?
rest. Yeah.
I'm having a little bit of a bad connection here.
Okay.
I'm going to try to move around a little bit and get a better connection.
Yeah, that's fine.
Keep talking. I'm listening.
Yeah. So I think, believers throughout, from the very beginning of the church, they're gathering on the Lord's Day, and that was supposed to be. It always has been like a mini Easter Sunday. That's what Sundays are supposed to be. We gather because we have hope in the resurrection. Everything we say on Easter Sunday are the same things we believe and proclaim and celebrate on any other Sunday when the church, the corporate church, gathers together. So I don't think there's anything mandated about celebrating one specific day for Easter, or any of the major Christian holidays for Christmas, right? There's nothing that says you have to celebrate Christmas. Those events in history, the birth of Christ, the resurrection of Christ, those are cosmic, universe shattering moments that, whether or not we celebrate, change everything around us. Do you know what I mean? So for us to say like we have to celebrate these, it doesn't make it more significant. But I think there's something about us connecting to that and setting aside that time and intentionally focusing on those events. It's very formative for us, just as part of our humanity. Like we are constantly being formed and shaped by things around us. And so I think there's something powerful about going, you could almost say ritualistic, but about going through patterns. And
all right, Dan, right now I'm having a really hard time hearing you. What you're saying sounds like it's solid gold, but there's a lot of delay. And I think part of that has to do with the connection that I have right now. What I'm going to do is I'm going to try to relocate and get some better Wi-Fi.
Okay.
Let's take a quick break and we'll come right back. So stay tuned if you're watching. And I'm just going to try to relocate and get a little bit of a better connection here.
Sounds good.
All right. We're going to try this again. Amazingly, we still have one viewer. Dan, you still with me?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes. Dan, if it's listen, what do you think about this, man? This is I've got the most bootleg setup right now. But
It's clear.
yeah, and I'm thankful for technology that allows us to have bootleg setups. Okay.
Yep.
All right, let's see here. Now, if I can get a little untangled. Dan, what I'd like to do, that stuff you were laying down was super good. My concern is that it was so broken up. I don't know that anybody could really trace that.
Yeah, I can do that again.
You want to just start over, and we're just doing this live, so anyone watching this on Facebook is getting a very wonderful behind the scenes coronavirus special here.
Oh man,
which is very nice. Let's see here. Okay, can you see me and hear me?
Yep, I can see you and hear you.
All right. This is great. Okay, so let's start this over. Let's try this again. Yeah. We're 12 minutes in, but can you let me do one thing real quick.
You're gonna shut the door.
Nobody wants to see inside of a bathroom podcast. All right, so let's start this over. Okay, we got people watching. Five people watching right now. So let's go ahead and get started, Dan.
Yeah.
We will begin our conversation at the beginning. Let's see here. Okay. One more thing. Good. All right. Here we go. Welcome to the Think Podcast with Joel Settecase. I'm Joel Settecase, and I'm joined today by my good friend and pastor, Dan Osborne. Dan and I are going to break down the subject of Holy Week. What is it? Why does it matter? And if you're just joining us, you really didn't miss anything. If you're not just joining us and you've been hanging with us over the last 13, 14 minutes, you have seen one of the most spectacular debacles ever to grace Facebook. And so, in the words of Maui, what can I say except you're welcome? Look, you're quarantined. I'm quarantined. We're trying to figure this out. But I knew that it was that we were going to have to talk about some theological topic today. And there's so many different questions swirling around us with regard to this whole coronavirus thing. So earlier today, I sent Dan a bunch of different topics. I said, what do you think about any of these? And one of them was Holy Week. I'm like, what do you think? And Dan suggested we do it. And I think that there's a lot of wisdom in that, because right now, with all of the corona craziness, we're giving ourselves and you an opportunity to touch base with something that is very not up to the minute. It's not hitting all the headlines. It's not the latest and greatest news. It is something that goes back to the very roots of Christian history. And that is this subject, Holy Week. So, Dan, when we're talking about Holy Week, what do we mean when we say Holy Week?
Yeah, I think for most people, what they're thinking of, if they're familiar with the phrase at all, is the week leading up to Easter Sunday. So you got Palm Sunday that traditionally kicks off Holy Week. And then depending on the particular Christian tradition you are, a part of, you may have every day is a reflecting on a significant moment in the last week of Jesus' earthly ministry, leading up to his crucifixion and then resurrection that we celebrate on Sunday, Easter Sunday.
All right. And what are the big days in Holy Week? Because I know Thursday, Friday. What are the big days and what's their significance?
Yeah. So I'd say the big ones that probably most people are familiar with are Palm Sunday, which is what we just had last Sunday. And then Maundy Thursday, Good Friday. Holy Saturday is some people are familiar with that one. And then Easter Sunday would be the big ones that I think most folks would be familiar with right now.
Okay. And so Palm Sunday, we celebrated that last Sunday.
Yeah.
I think most people are probably familiar with that, but just in case there's someone watching,
Yeah.
what is Palm Sunday?
Yeah, so Palm Sunday that's what we remember Jesus entering into Jerusalem the week before his death. So he comes in, right, he basically sends his disciples to get a donkey for him. He rides in towards Jerusalem, and his followers, depending on which gospel account you're looking at, they'll include his followers and other people, religious leaders are all there. They've got palm branches. They're throwing their cloaks down on the road as he's walking in. It's kind of a royal entrance for a civil leader, in that time period.
Okay, so that's Palm Sunday.
That's Palm Sunday. Yeah.
Entry,
Mm-hmm.
And then let's fast forward to Maundy Thursday. What's happening on Thursday? Why is it important?
Yeah.
Why do we commemorate that?
Yeah, so Maundy Thursday is part of a section in Scripture, particularly in the Gospel of John, known as the Upper Room Discourse. So this starts off the conversation that Jesus has on the night he is betrayed. He has, it's a long sermon. It takes up, I think, 3 chapters in the Gospel of John, where he's giving like his final instructions to his disciples, very intimate, close setting. And one of the things that he does there is he washes the disciples' feet, and he gives a commandment to, like, this is the way you ought to love one another. In fact, that's what we call it Maundy Thursday. It's from the Latin word. I'm going to butcher my Latin, mandatum, which is just mandate, right? It's a command that Jesus gives to his disciples to love one another. And I think the particular image he's got in mind is by washing someone else's feet. So, I grew up with a foot washing service on Maundy Thursday. You'd go in and you'd wash each other's feet in the church.
What denomination was that?
That was, we were United Methodist. That was kind of bucking the United Methodist system as a whole. So at that point in time, it was very, very loosely United Methodist.
Gotcha.
And certainly not what most people would think of as United Methodist today.
Okay.
So, yeah. And then you go into Good Friday. Good Friday, obviously the crucifixion, remembering the Jesus' death on a cross. Holy Saturday is kind of the silent day where the gospel accounts don't really have anything recorded about what happens in the day that Jesus is, he's in the tomb, the full day. Full Saturday is what we remember. And it's kind of this silent day. A lot of times it's celebrated with an Easter vigil late at night, so that the first thing you do that on Sunday morning, like into Sunday morning midnight, is you're celebrating Easter already. So that's Holy Saturday, and then obviously Easter Sunday is looking at the resurrection.
Yeah. All right, and I think when a lot of people think of Holy Week, just let the record show all that yelling is not my kids. So my kids are super well behaved downstairs. I'm kidding. I don't know what my kids are doing right now. They're being watched by grandma right now downstairs. But this is one of the joys of being dads, right? Yeah. So those are good sounds. We like to hear the sounds of kids running around. And, children are a blessing. So, when a lot of people think about like Holy Week and observing Holy Week, and they might, it's very much tied in with sort of the culmination of Lent.
Yeah.
Kicks off with
Ash Wednesday. Mm-hmm.
A lot of people hear this and they go, "Oh, that's Catholic. That's Roman Catholic." I grew up in the Evangelical Free Church. I didn't know what the word Maundy meant. I had no clue. Right. When I first heard about Maundy Thursday, that sounded like some weird foreign thing to me. So, as Protestants, is Holy Week something that we're supposed to care about? Is this something that we're like, are we required to observe it? Do we need to go to church every day this week? Why, as evangelicals or Protestants or, just non-Catholics, do we care about Holy Week?
Yeah. So I think, careful listeners will pick up on a difference of something you just said between something that's Roman Catholic and something that is Catholic. And I think that's an important distinction, because a lot of the Holy Week celebration is actually bigger than just a Roman Catholic tradition, which would be something that, when we think of Roman Catholic, we've got to think like Council of Trent post that, First Vatican Council, right? That's 15-ish, somewhere around that time.
Yeah. So you're talking like from the point of the Counter-Reformation and forward.
Yeah. That's where I think a lot of the stuff that we know of today as Roman Catholicism is really taking shape and codified then. But before that, though, you don't really have much else. I mean, you have a not completely unified church, but there's not like the Eastern Orthodox yet. Prior to 1100, there's not the Protestants. There's not the official Catholic. Yeah. So these things that, these Holy Week celebrations actually stretch back towards the 2nd and 3rd century. They're very old. And you can even see some of them already taking shape in the earliest Christian traditions. I think Paul was already referencing, some of these kinds of practices very, very early on.
Okay. And, something that I've always wondered is, do God's people have the right to create our own holidays? Because in the Old Testament, you've got certain biblical holidays. You've got the Feast of Tabernacles, Sukkot. You've got the Feast of Unleavened Bread leading up to Passover. You've got Passover itself. Of course, the Day of Atonement. You've got, there are holidays, holy days that are mandated by God to be observed. And the question is, well, do all of our holidays have to come from God, or is there a biblical mandate for there being special days that we set aside that are actually created by God's people? In the Old Testament, we're talking about the nation state of Israel, covenant people of God. In the New Testament era, we're talking about the church. And, two examples of that would be Purim and Hanukkah. And actually, Purim is reflected in
Esther, the
book of Esther, right? And then Hanukkah is from the intertestamental period between the Old and New Testaments. But Jesus himself celebrated Hanukkah when he went. That was the Feast of Dedication.
Yeah.
And so that festival, the Festival of Lights, that was celebrated by Jesus. So there is some biblical warrant, I think, there for God's people creating our own holidays, as long as, and I want to know if you agree with this, as long as we don't make it a religious requirement to observe them. Correct?
Yes. Oh, yeah. Yeah, 100%.
And now, does that apply to Easter as well? You think about Easter and Christmas being the big days of the Christian calendar. Are we required to celebrate Easter? Are we required to celebrate Christmas?
No, not in that as the holidays that we think of them today. I mean, I certainly wouldn't consider putting a church member under discipline for refusing to acknowledge Christmas or refusing to acknowledge Easter Sunday, with the caveat that they said, look, we were always celebrating Jesus' first advent, or his, on Christmas, we celebrate that as a reality we all live in, and we always celebrate the resurrection. So yeah, I would totally agree with what you've just said.
Yeah, it's something you were saying earlier. Every Sunday is Resurrection.
Every Sunday is Resurrection Sunday. It matters every Sunday, right? And then, the other piece of this, though, Joel, is, you asked, is it required? Should we do this? No, I don't think it's required. But I think we're actually robbing ourselves of an experience with if we intentionally neglect Holy Week. I think there's something very powerful about that. And let me unpack this a little bit, because I've been thinking a lot about this recently. We're getting ready to celebrate Good Friday at Park, and there's a lot of questions about what does that look like, and churches all across the country. What I am hearing is that this is an unprecedented Good Friday. And in some sense, it's true, right? Like, there's no really record of Christians celebrating Good Friday in the way that we are going to do this right now. But if you kind of put yourself in the position of the first disciples, like in the upper room, this is as close as we could possibly get to what they were actually experiencing.
Wow.
You see what I mean? Like, and let's broaden this a little bit, because a lot of the discussions around things like the Eucharist or communion, and whether or not we should take them right now. If you read these, most of the articles written about this right now are going to focus in on the Gospels, and they're going to focus in on 1 Corinthians 11. When what we should really be doing is broadening that conversation and going back to Exodus 12 in the actual Passover, because in the upper room discourse, what is Jesus doing? He's celebrating the Passover. In fact, all four Gospels call out the fact that he is celebrating the Passover with his disciples. Right. And so there's something that he is doing that's very normal in a Jewish home at that time. By the way, you should note that Jews at that time for the Passover celebration were unified in that they did it together at the same time, but they were intentionally called to do it in their own homes, to take this meal in their own homes, right? They were unified because everybody was doing it at sundown on the same day. So anyway, they're having this Passover meal. They don't know what's going to happen, but Jesus does some pretty predictable things. He gets up and starts teaching. That's what would have happened in a Passover meal.
That's still what happens today when we go over to my in-laws and we celebrate Passover. It's from a messianic standpoint, but the father of the home, my wife's father, he'll open up the Haggadah, and different people will read different portions of it, but he guides us through the service much in the same way Jesus would have done. But that is such an interesting point, what you just mentioned. The Passover was celebrated in the home, and as we take the Lord's Supper, communion, the Eucharist, whatever you want to call it, that comes from, it's not identical to Passover, but it certainly is a continuation of Passover. Yeah. It's a fulfillment of Passover in many ways.
Right. So what the disciples would not have expected is for Jesus to say, essentially, I am the true Passover lamb. And that's what happens next, is he is led, that they reflect, like Peter reflects on this later and says, he's the lamb to the slaughter in 1 Peter 2. Right. And so he is embodying the true Passover. But that upper room discourse is kicked off in the privacy of a home where his Jesus' family, his disciples are gathered together, and then they move into Holy Week. That is exactly what we've been doing this week.
Yeah.
In what better way could we possibly parallel what was actually happening the very first Good Friday leading into that? And so I think for me, pastorally, and what I hope the congregation at Forest Glen is seeing, and at Park, is that we're now, this is not like an odd thing. It's odd because we've never done this before, but this isn't the first time this has happened. And so we're able to experience this in a very fresh way, and go into things like the Maundy Thursday mentality, where we are commanded to love one another and serve one another. What a picture for a husband to sit down tomorrow night and wash his wife's feet. To say, this is what Jesus done for me. This is how I'm choosing to love you.
So as we think about Maundy Thursday, and which is when the Last Supper was, which is where we get communion from, is it legitimate, Dan? Because you're going to get depending on maybe who hears this, you could potentially get a lot of pushback on this. Do you think it is a legitimate thing for a family in the home to take communion, and in what needs to be, I guess, how should that be done? What precautions should we put in place? Is that legitimate? Because that's a very different thing than the folks who say, no, it has to be the gathered congregation, maybe not in a church building, but certainly on Sunday morning worship. So are they both equally legitimate? Is one more legitimate? How would Jesus answer that question?
I hesitate to put words in his mouth. I think so. How I've processed this, and by the way, tomorrow I have a conversation set aside with Phil Adams and Trevor Lovell to talk about communion during the quarantine, and I think it's going to be a fascinating conversation. But I think you have to keep in mind that Paul comes back later and kind of you have to assume that believers have been practicing communion, taking the past, in some sense, this abbreviated Passover meal together, reflecting it, because Paul comes in and corrects how they've been doing it. Right. The assumption is they've been doing it already. Mm-hmm. And he gives some instructions. And again, like his point that he's driving in is that there is a unity that needs to happen in this. This is something you do when the church gathers together. So what I don't think is legitimate is that, a family just decides one day we're going to sit down and do communion together as a family.
Okay.
Because that misses the unity piece. Like even going back to Exodus 12, the point is they're doing it together. They're doing it at the same time at sundown. And there's even, regulations about what happens if somebody does it wrong. They're supposed to be put out from the congregation of Israel if they don't do this. Right, which mirrors some of the things that Paul says. Like there's consequences for not practicing the Lord's Supper in the right way. But he comes on in 1 Corinthians 11 to say, this is why some of you are weak and sick, and that some of you've even died because you've been mishandling the Lord's Supper.
Right, you haven't been discerning the body, the body of Christ, the body and the body of the church as well. The unity is missing. Right.
So I think we should always strive for that unifying piece, which in my mind weeds out a family deciding to do this by themselves or a small group. I think that weeds out a small group deciding to do this by themselves, unless the church has said, on this night, we are going to gather in our homes and celebrate the Lord's Supper together at the same time, at the same hour on the same day.
Okay, let me push back on that for a second, because in Acts 2:42, all the believers they would meet in the temple.
Yep.
And then they would meet in each other's homes and they would break bread. They were devoted to the apostles' teaching, to fellowship. And many have used that passage as a justification for small groups. They say, look, you've got the large I've used it myself. You've got the large corporate meeting, then you've got the in-home meetings. And that passage, if that's a small group, what are they doing? They're breaking bread, which many have seen as a euphemism isn't the right word, but sort of a shorthand way of saying they're taking communion.
Yeah.
There was a love feast. There was a meal associated with that. What are your thoughts on that?
I just think it's a stretch to, like, it's very anachronistic to look back and say, or that's taking our modern conception of what small group community is and then trying to read it back into the text. I don't think that's what happened.
Are you saying that they didn't use Lifeway Bible studies? They didn't. They didn't have the little prepackaged communion cups. Come on, man. They had all the same stuff.
Yeah, let's go one step further. They didn't even have a New Testament then.
Ooh, now you're going too far, Dan. Now you're going too far.
Well,
they had the apostles' teaching though.
They did have the apostles' teaching.
But yeah, no, it wasn't codified.
They didn't have 1 Corinthians yet. Not for a while.
1 Corinthians? Yeah, well, true. They definitely didn't have any of the epistles, pastoral epistles.
Yeah, it would be years and years before they had it. That's beside the point. It's a little facetious. So what I'm saying is, I don't think that to look back at Acts 2:42 and say that's why you should do small groups, I think misses the point. I think you can look back at Acts 2:42 and say that's why you need to be in community as a Christian. Like, it's baked into the model of what it means to be a follower of Christ, is to be gathering with other Christians. But even then, it doesn't say they did this for an hour and a half to 2 hours once a week. This is day by day they're doing these things. So I think it's much more holistic and maybe even too simplistic to say this is small groups taking communion together.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'm going to try to summarize what you just said and put it up as a comment here. The family in home celebrating the Lord's Supper whenever isn't legitimate in terms of being communion. but the church all together at home celebrating in their homes at the same time, that is legitimate. That at least could be
Yeah.
legitimate.
Yeah.
There's a congregational aspect to it.
Yeah, because the point of communion is that this is something you're doing together.
Mm.
So if you don't do it together, it's not communion. Look, if you want to celebrate the Lord's death and have a thankfulness over the gospel, is that not what we do every time we sit down before a meal and thank God for his provision and thank him for his goodness and kindness to us? I mean, in 1 Corinthians 10, he ends that chapter right before he gets into the communion section. He talks about whether you eat or drink, you do all of this to the glory of Christ.
Yes.
So when you're sitting down to have a meal, parents, families, that is an opportunity for you every time to instruct your kids in how to have a thankfulness to the gospel of God's provision for you. I mean, I don't know, but that doesn't mean it's, you're doing this in the same way with everybody, with the rest of the church. Does that make any sense?
I really think it does. And I got to tell you, it's very interesting to me because it's something that I've been perplexed about myself. How do we celebrate communion? How do we do the Lord's Supper when we're separate like this? And I just think again, I don't know if I'm 100% sold right now, but I think I'm most of the way there. It's just, we're in this unique situation right now,
Right.
as
Right.
we record this, for someone watching later or listening later. As we record this, there's this lockdown. Illinois was one of the first states to really encourage a lockdown.
Right.
And so we haven't met. How many Sundays have we missed? 3 Sundays now?
The 15th, the 29th, and the 7th.
Yeah. So, and now on the 12th.
Oh, the 4 Sundays, 15th, the 22nd, the 29th, and the 5th. Sorry. Yeah.
The 5th. That's right. That's right. And so now on the 12th, Easter Sunday will be our fifth Sunday, which is incredible. And it's like, man, how do we take communion? How do we have the Lord's Supper here, especially on Holy Week when we remember the Last Supper? That's where the Lord's Supper comes from.
Yeah.
And so I think you're giving us a lot to think about here. I think this is good, and I think it's important because you mentioned earlier, if we get this wrong, if we neglect the celebration and the remembrance this week, we're actually robbing ourselves of an important experience.
Yeah.
And so what you're doing here is you're showing us, well, how do we not only keep from robbing ourselves, but how do we make sure that we give ourselves this, or allow ourselves to receive this gift, but do it in a way that's biblical rather than just haphazard.
Yeah. But let me summarize my point in this way, Joel. There's two significant events that we're looking at. We're looking at the Passover on the one hand, and then the true and better Passover. One being Exodus 12 and the Lamb, and the other being Good Friday, Jesus crucified on a cross.
The Lamb who was slain for the sins of the world. Yeah.
These are both, and they're connected to Passover. Both, like Peter will look back and connect this and use very similar language in 1 Peter 2 to Passover language, right? And the bridge there is Isaiah 53. But both of those significant moments are celebrated by a meal. So in the same way that the Passover corresponds to the crucifixion, so the remembrance of the Passover meal in Exodus 12 corresponds to the Lord's Supper. That's what I'm saying. That's how I'm thinking of it. And so the conclusion I'm drawing from that is that in this season, it is permissible, I believe, for people to receive communion in their homes while we're doing it on the same day at roughly the same time.
And I want to respond to something really quick that your parents, I don't know if it's your mom or dad, but someone commented on Facebook and said, she said, I'm assuming it's your mom. It could be your dad.
No, my mom.
Okay. Holy days of obligation is the phrase that she put up there. And that's from her Roman Catholic upbringing. But what you're saying is it's not a day of obligation in the same sense that the Roman Catholic Church might teach, correct?
Right. I would say holy days of formation.
Oh, all right. Go with that. What do you mean?
I think, this is not an original thought, but we are we are formational beings. Like the habits we develop for ourselves form the way that we think about the world, how we process, what's going on around us, the rituals that we participate in. This is why people will get so excited about Christmas and not very excited about Easter, because around Christmas there is so much external happening. You're constantly bombarded by ads. There's all the music. There's all of the family Christmas parties, the songs that you sing together. Like, it's this whole system that most of us alive today have grown up in. And so you start anticipating it at the very beginning of, once Thanksgiving happens, the formation process of Christmas time kicks in. And you're extra jolly. You see what I'm trying to say? Like, there is a formation that has happened around that time of the year. You don't have all the songs. You don't have all the gifts in the same way. You don't have all the rhythms around culturally around Easter, right? So it's no surprise. Most people are more excited about Christmas than they are about Easter.
Yeah, I like Easter. Easter's a lot less stressful than Christmas.
It is a lot. Right. But there's so much going on, right? But the Holy Week, what you're doing is you are intentionally fixing your mind in the services with other believers. You're creating those formational patterns, right? Of love, sacrifice, triumph, victory. Like you are rehearsing the gospel, and
that's good.
You might not feel it this year, but I guarantee that will have an effect on you over the course of 5 years, 10 years, 40 years.
That's something very interesting too. And you mentioned this in a sermon last month. Maybe it was at the end of February, but conforming your mind, walking in the Spirit and setting your mind on the things of the Spirit is a process that does happen little by little. And so it's interesting to think about being formed year by year. I think about my own kids. I've got 4 kids.
Yeah.
And, every year as we celebrate Holy Week or we celebrate Easter, that's laying another brick in the wall of their formation, or another brick in the path, or however you want to phrase it.
Yeah.
So that's interesting, man. That's cool. So what are we doing for this week? What's your family doing? What are we doing as a church?
Yeah.
And how can other churches celebrate Holy Week as we celebrate it together and apart?
So we are doing Olive Park is doing the same Good Friday service that will be sent out. And if the church-wide email was sent out yesterday about, when this is happening on Friday at 5 and 7. And then I've got a follow-up email coming on today and this evening that explains how the communion side will happen, right? Where we will have, what kind of elements can you use in your home? Which is a very interesting question, Joel. What should you use for communion at home in your family? Is there freedom to use marshmallows and chocolate sauce?
Or Heaven Hill bourbon?
It's a question. So we're going to be sending out some instructions on how to do that. What to use if you don't have bread and wine or grape juice.
Wow.
And we're going to do what they did in Exodus 12 and in Luke 20 with the Lord's Supper. We're going to take it together.
Very, very cool. Dan, I know you've got to go. I've got to go. Just really quickly, one of the things that you got copies of an incredible book called The Good of Giving Up by Aaron Damiani, who is an Anglican pastor here in Chicago. He's Anglican, but hey, man, we won't hold that against him. He can't be non-denominational like us. That's fine. But I'm just kidding. My sister and brother-in-law are Anglican. I love them dearly. And but you have these 5 copies. Would you say if someone were around Chicago, if they're around the Northwest side, is that something? How could they get their hands on one of these copies for free?
I would think it would be the first, 5 people who subscribe to the Think podcast after this
That's good, but don't do that because I actually can't see who's subscribing. I
Oh,
can
you
see who
can't?
leave. No, I can see who leave 5-star ratings and
Okay.
reviews. I'm good with that.
Let's do that, and then if you're in the Chicagoland area, shoot me a Facebook message, and we can arrange a time for you to pick it up or send it to you some way.
Love it. All right. Well, you heard that. We're adding another layer to the book giveaway. Also, want to remind you to get connected with the Think Institute by going to thethink.institute. While you're there, you can sign up for the Think Update, which right now is the latest concise of our most recent episodes. There's going to be other tips and tools and things to help you explain, share, and defend your faith. Well, we tackled another impossible question. What is the meaning of Holy Week for Christians? Why do I care? And we got off on a great rabbit trail talking about communion, how do we do it in homes. Dan is going to be having another video on that subject tomorrow with some other park pastors. Stay tuned for that. Follow Dan. Follow his blog. It's danosborneblog.wordpress.com. You can check that out. It's called A Pastor's Blog, and it's very, very good. He's got some good stuff, good practical updates on there as well. And this is not goodbye. This is just a little stop. This has been a pit stop on your spiritual journey. I sincerely hope that you have heard something practical to put into practice over the next few days. Stay tuned to the Think podcast for all the stuff you need so that you never get caught flat-footed when asked to explain the Christian message. Until next time, I hope it made you think.